Let's walk down Bladensburg Road, Northeast DC. Bladensburg Road has been described as residential and industrial along with retail. And this long street predates the creation of DC because originally Bladensburg Road only lay inside of Bladensburg, Maryland. As Washington, D.C. was created and carved out of Maryland and Virginia, the northeast side of D.C. was forests and farms. It was considered the countryside of the new Washington city that was being laid out in what we now consider downtown D.C. We went down this road before in a previous video, but I want to give a little more history about this area as well as some updates. This time we'll go up and over the hill past Mount Olivet Cemetery on our left. Once we're over the hill, we'll come to a major intersection of Bladensburg Road and New York Avenue. If we continue to the right of this intersection, we could connect to I-295 from New York Avenue. The interstate highway can take you north to Baltimore, or you can go south to Virginia. But if we turn left on New York Avenue, that would lead us to northwest and directly to downtown DC. But if we continue straight through this intersection, we'll come to the underpass of the Pennsylvania Railroad track. To our immediate left is Queens Chapel Road. Today in our modern era, this is a short street, but its length and history was much longer, long time ago. The Queen family wasn't royalty, but they were wealthy through marriage. A lot of the Queen family history was an oral history, but a family will was found to clear up some speculations. Many Queen descendants were named after aunts, uncles, fathers, and grandfathers, so the role of certain members were attributed to the wrong relative. But the basic story remains the same no matter what historian told the story. DC blogger Robert Molesky mentioned in his blog the same question that many people had about this street. Just where is the Queen's Chapel? He writes in his blog, what we now know as 18th Street Northeast, the original eastern boundary line of the Brooklyn neighborhood, was once part of Queens Chapel Road, which ran from the Hyattsville area all the way to Bladensburg Road. This road was the route to the Catholic chapel on the colonial estate of the Queen family. Queen's Chapel stood near the intersection of today's 20th and Evart Street in the Langdon neighborhood. The story starts with Samuel Queen coming to Maryland from England in 1685. Some versions say his grandson Richard built a mansion in Maryland. Another version was his son Richard built the mansion in 1722 on a section of land in the Langdon neighborhood, and they called it the Enclosure, along with another piece of property called Haddock's Hills. This property was given to Richard Queen from a grant from the proprietor of Maryland, the second Baron Baltimore, Cecil Calvert. Some other versions of the story say that it was Samuel's son Marsham, not Richard, who built the mansion. The Queen family was a slave-holding family, and most likely the slaves literally built the mansion and all other property held by the Queen family. In this mansion, the Queen family set aside a room to be used as a chapel. The chapel was pretty much a secret, but the Queen family did invite other Catholics from the neighborhood and surrounding area. Most of the black people in attendance were believed to be the slaves of other attendees, and they too were welcome to come and worship there in secret. A priest was able to come once or twice a month because Catholic services were considered dangerous. Even though America was supposed to be the land of the free, especially from religious persecution, the Maryland legislature passed a law in 1704 that prevented Catholics from owning or inheriting land. This law also charged a 50-pound fine and 6 months in jail to any priest who gave Mass in the Maryland colony. But the law against Catholic land ownership was either not enforced or it didn't apply to those Catholics who already owned land before the law was passed. By the founding of Queen's Chapel in 1722, the law was very relaxed, but precautions were still taken. The Queen family grew larger, and so did the number of people attending Mass at their chapel. The room used for the chapel was now too small and was needed by the family, so the chapel was moved to an outside building. And it's this outside building that was nicknamed Queen's Chapel. The chapel was disguised as a smokehouse where hams and meats were cured. According to the family oral tradition, the smokehouse had a huge bell, seemingly to call the slaves in from the field, but actually to inform Catholics in the area to know when a priest had come to offer Mass. This building has become known as Queen's Chapel, but officially the family called it St. Mary's Chapel. But Queen's Chapel is the name that stuck. Here's an illustration of the church from a 1901 article in the Evening Star. The Queen's Chapel wasn't considered official until the lost will of Richard Queen was found, and this document declared the name and new owner of the land after his passing in 1794. All other property was divided among Richard Queen's heirs 6 years later. Many years later, the Queen family descendants contested the ownership of the family graveyard that lay behind the church. But at this point in 1901, the church building itself was no longer standing, and the 2 acres that was used for the graveyard seems to have been abandoned. The fencing was down and the grounds were overgrown with vegetation. The family wanted to declare the 2 acres of land listed in the name of the heirs to Charles and Maria Queen and no longer in the name of Cardinal Gibbons. Richard Queen's will is the first documented mention of Queen's Chapel and its location and its true owner. A copy of Richard Queen's will is in the Catholic University's archives, and a portion of his will said, "I give and bequeath to my friend, the Right Reverend John Carroll, Bishop of Baltimore, his heirs or assigns forever, they remaining members of the Roman Catholic Church, 2 acres of land where the Roman Catholic Chapel now stands, being a part of a tract of land called the enclosure. My intention and will is that said 2 acres of land be solely employed and used for the religious purposes of the Roman Catholic congregation. I do hereby oblige my executors to measure off and bound the said 2 acres of land within 12 months of my demise." There's an article from a 1976 edition of the Catholic Standard newspaper where a direct descendant of Richard Queen is the author of the history of Queen's Chapel. Henry Queen explains how religious services were conducted at the Queen estate by a Jesuit priest and Bishop John Carroll, who was a personal friend of Richard Queen, and he frequently offered Mass at the chapel. But the tragedy of the chapel was that it was burned down 3 times and rebuilt twice by the Queen family. Family tradition has said the first time it was set ablaze, it was an accident. The second time, it was set ablaze by British troops in 1814 in their march from Bladensburg to the capital city, which is D.C. The third time was when the Civil War occurred around 1862. Allegedly, it was set ablaze by some members of the Massachusetts Heavy Artillery. They set up camp at Fort Bunker Hill in Northeast because allegedly some of these men believed some of the Queen family members were Southern sympathizers. In the fall of 1906, the Catholic men of the neighborhood and surrounding area started construction of a new church on the original site of Queen's Chapel. The cornerstone for the church was laid in 1907, and the church was named in honor of St. Francis de Sales. Here's a photo of that new church. But decades later, Father Malloy, the pastor at the time, felt the church has become too small for the growing congregation and needed a more central location for its followers. The present-day location on Rhode Island Avenue, Northeast, was purchased, and the new St. Francis de Sales Church was built in 1927. The Queen family property was sold, and the deceased family members that remained on the property were removed from their ancestral plots and placed in Mount Olivet Cemetery, more than a mile away. Now let's turn back around and go back to the intersection of Bladensburg Road and New York Avenue. Bladensburg Road was considered a marvel of modern times in the 1900s. An article in the Washington Evening Star from 1931 started by saying, "Bladensburg Road is one of the finest entrances leading into Washington. Since the recent improvement it has undergone both on the district side and the Maryland side, it is as good a road as one will find anywhere." This article mentions that the writer feels the DC commissioners were worthy of much praise for improving the travel time from northwest to northeast, with the extension of New York Avenue from Florida Avenue to meet Bladensburg Road. The writer of this 1931 article also questions the audience. How many people can recall that the Bladensburg Pike was a narrow thoroughfare lined with scrub trees on either side, and, barring the rough stone surface, a fairly good road in dry weather, but a very bad one when the earth was saturated with rain, and even when the best of drivers could not help getting stuck in the mud up to the hubs? Now in 2024, the corner of Bladensburg Road and New York Avenue have hotels and a gas station on it. Further up the street is a small residential area. But back in the 1800s, Bladensburg Road housed families that were moderately wealthy in a large house on larger pieces of land, and one of those homeowners was Anton Rupert and his family. Anton Rupert was profiled as one of the pioneering residents of DC on Bladensburg Road back in 1931. Anton was a farmer back in Germany and decided to come to America, and then became so successful he made the U.S. his permanent home. He landed in D.C. in 1852 at the age of 18, then found a wife 5 years later. He married Anastasia Schwing, who was his age, and she also was German. 4 classes of people were deemed highly valuable back then. They were the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and the farmer. Anton Rupert arrived in America as a farmer, but he partnered with his cousin Henry for several years and became a butcher. Gas and electricity reduced the need for candles and candlesticks, but the butcher, the baker, and the farmer reigned supreme. Anton established his first slaughterhouse on the same site that the American League baseball park in the Trinidad neighborhood was built on, land that was minutes away from his future home on Bladensburg Road. Here's a 1903 Sanborn fire insurance map for a DC property showing the location of houses next to the ballpark in the lower right-hand corner of the map. The American League Park was built in 1891 for professional baseball teams. It was the home field for the Washington Senators for the 1901 to 1903 baseball seasons. Today, the lot has apartment buildings, row houses, and a firehouse. The business began for Anton shortly after his wedding in 1857. While Anton and his wife lived in Northwest on 11th and U Street, Anton and Henry's partnership ended in 1860. 1 year later, in 1861, Anton moved to Bladensburg Road and started building his empire. Anton had 2 meat shop locations before he expanded. He added buildings to his farm as his businesses grew, and he added to his house as his family grew. Anton bought land in 1865 on Bladensburg Road that was near the intersection of New York Avenue. New York Avenue wasn't laid any further than this point at that time. Anton's farm was carved out of a tract of 300 or more acres of land that was known as the Enclosure and Haddock's Hills. Haddock's Hills was named after an earlier owner, Benjamin Haddock, in the 1600s. 2 years later, Anton bought another piece of land to increase the size of his farm. This piece of land was sold to Anton from William Wilson Corcoran. Corcoran was a banker, an art collector, and well known as a philanthropist. Corcoran resided in luxury in his mansion on the corner of Lafayette Park at the intersection of 8th Street and Connecticut Avenue Northwest from 1848 to his passing in 1888. The Corcoran family house was sold, then knocked down in 1922 to be replaced by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce building. Corcoran was the son of an Irish immigrant and made his fortune in banking. He was a partner in Corcoran and Riggs Bank during the Mexican-American War. He was responsible for the sale of government war bonds to England, establishing the American government's credit overseas. Corcoran's father was a wealthy merchant, twice elected as mayor of Georgetown. His father was born in Ireland but settled in Georgetown in 1788 and started a leather business. William Corcoran had collected so much artwork that in the 1850s his sculpture and pictures were overflowing his mansion on Lafayette Square, and in 1859 he hired an architect to build a picture gallery for him on Pennsylvania Avenue. The building was finished in 1869, and the Corcoran Gallery of Art opened 5 years later, in 1874. A new building for the Corcoran Gallery of Art and Corcoran School of Art was completed in 1897, 9 years after Corcoran's passing. The Corcoran's gallery first home is now the Renwick Gallery, a Smithsonian museum. William Corcoran had a large piece of land in Northeast that he used as his country getaway for vacations, like many other wealthy landowners in D.C. He renamed his tract of land Corcoran Hill. Before the land was sold to Anton by Corcoran in 1867, it was sold to Corcoran by Colonel William Hickey. When Colonel Hickey owned the land, it was called Mount Hamilton. Colonel Hickey was a clerk in the U.S. Senate in 1843, and his mansion in Northeast was called the Showplace of D.C. before the Civil War because of his lavish parties with celebrities and dignitaries, such as pro-slavery Senator John C. Calhoun and pro-slavery Senator Daniel Webster. Hickey came from a family of old money that migrated to Maryland from England in the 1600s. Colonel Hickey passed away in 1866, so his house remained vacant for many years. Here's a 1929 article that explains that the 100-year-old house had caught fire from an old defective fireplace flue. The old mansion had a forest of trees surrounding it that were older than the house itself. The isolated location and the look of the old house helped create many midnight ghost stories from the estimated 5 or 6 different black families that used to live there. The house was then known as a haunted house. Rumors circulated from the residents that the earth beneath the house were honeycombed with subterranean channels and there was a mysterious room down in the basement. The house first caught fire January 1929 and then again in August, therefore gutting it. The house was later purchased by the Hudson Brick Company and the basement was boarded up. Part of the land that Colonel Hickey owned was previously owned by Richard Queen. It's estimated that Colonel Hickey built his house around 1830, and the impression given was that Colonel Hickey lived in Anton's house before Anton and his family did. It's thought that the colonel briefly lived in the house until his own mansion was built further away for his own growing family. The first piece of property Anton bought was owned by Dr. Charles Nichols, 2 years before Anton bought it. Dr. Charles Nichols was a brain surgeon who became the superintendent of the Government Hospital for the Insane in Southeast DC, later known as St. Elizabeth's Hospital. The hospital was completed in 1852, and this was America's first large-scale federally run psychiatric hospital. Dr. Nichols was superintendent there for 25 years until 1877, when he then became superintendent at the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum in New York City. Before the city would officially pave the streets, private roads were created by the residents. Hickey Road was a private road that separated the farms of Anton Rupert, Dr. Palmer, and other landowners. This same private road entered from the south of Colonel Hickey's farm and crossed the span of multiple properties. The McQueenie property, which was on the opposite side of Bladensburg Road, was headed by Mr. Edward McQueenie, who had a flower shop on Boundary Street, later renamed Florida Avenue, and the McQueenie family gas station was a short distance away from their house on Bladensburg Road. North of Anton's farm was Santis Off's property. He also was a butcher. Later, Mr. Off's property would be occupied by Hugh McQueenie because he married the daughter of Mr. Off. Nicholas Off's property was further north of Santis Off's property, and his house used to be occupied by another butcher named Mr. Laurer. Mr. Laurer's wife was the sister of Henry Rupert, who had his own slaughterhouse on Sherman Avenue Northwest. Leopold Luke's property was to the east of Anton's farm. Mr. Luke's grew tobacco and had a popular cigar business with his brother. When parts of Colonel Hickey's property was sold, some of that land was purchased by Leopold Luke's. All of these properties are shown on a 1913 Greenville map courtesy of the Library of Congress. Here's another map courtesy of the Library of Congress from 1863 that shows Mount Hamilton, also referencing its new owner at the time, William Wilson Corcoran. Here's a third map courtesy of the Library of Congress called the Map of Long Meadows Embracing the Resurvey of the Wilderness, Queen's Hazard, and parts of the enclosure, Grange and Muir, and Chance. This is a hand-drawn map from 1800 showing the last piece of the enclosure that's south of Queens Chapel Road still remaining. There's more of the enclosure property in the Brooklyn neighborhood, and I'm sure I'll cover that in another video. Next to the enclosure is Queen's Hazard. I'll assume that's more land that used to belong to the Queen family. So far, I haven't found another reference to this piece of land. The northern part of this map illustrates Haddock Hill Farm, and Bladensburg Road is drawn down the left side of that. Below Queen's Hazard is the property called Chance, and above it is Grange and Muir. The name of the land changed with every new owner. That's why so many maps have different names on it for the same piece of property for a different time period. At the time of this 1931 news article, Anton's surviving children were interviewed, and they're the ones we are depending on for this information about Anton and his family. Anton's daughter, Annie Marie, gave the interview in the old family home. She gave the reporter a guided tour of the house, which she estimated to be at least 150 years old at the time. In the rear of the house was a greenhouse where Annie Marie grew flowers for her own pleasure, as it was described. Years after the passing of both her parents, the farm still had 2 brick ice houses, rows of sheds for smoking and curing meats, stables for cattle and horses, and a corn crib. The farmhouse was a colonial style with 8 rooms, an attic, a cellar full of wine, and the property covered 23 acres. Mrs. Anastasia Rupert passed away at age 74 in 1909 at home on Bladensburg Road and was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery. Anton also passed away at home 2 years later in 1911. He is also buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery. Anton's daughter Annie Marie married Henry Getz, son of Augustus Getz, well-known father and son building contractors in D.C. I found this 1906 printing in the Washington Post of 2 lawsuits by Central National Bank. The first one was against Anton and his son-in-law Henry Getz for $2,900, and the second lawsuit was against Henry Getz and his father for $1,800. I guess you can't always do business with family. Anton's youngest son was John Anton Rupert, and he married Mary Roth Schwing, the adopted daughter of his uncle, William Schwing. William Schwing was the co-owner of the Patent Office restaurant, located for many years at the corner of 7th and G Streets Northwest. Anton left his son, John Anton, his butcher business in his will, and the remaining estate in a trust for his wife to be taken care of for the rest of her life. But unfortunately, she passed on 2 years before he did. Anton's daughter, Annie Marie, and son, Louis, were each to receive a house for as long as they lived, but unfortunately, Louis passed on in 1913, 2 years after Anton. After John Anton's first wife passed on, he married a second time and moved to Chevy Chase with his new wife. He never had any children. Here's the deed to one of the properties being transferred from John Anton to other relatives, Henry J. Rupert, George, and Bernard in 1886. What makes this deed so interesting is that it was signed off by Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was the recorder of land deeds in D.C. at that time. Anton's house was eventually knocked down in 1938. I found this article about Anton losing a bank check, and it was found on 9th and 8th Street, 4.5 months before his passing away. Here's another article saying they found Anton. The police said they were not alarmed because he eventually found his way back home. Anton said he wasn't feeling well, so he stopped at a friend's house. Henry Rupert, Anton's cousin, bought 9 acres of land on Sherman Avenue Northwest with his wife Gertrude and raised 7 children there. Henry's son, Frank, opened a hardware store in the 1000 block of 7th Street Northwest in 1894, establishing a family business on that street for 120 years. The Sherman Avenue property was the basis for Frank and his brother John's real estate business, which originally operated out of the hardware store on 7th Street. The real estate business was eventually run by Frank's grandson and great-grandson. Henry Rupert's descendants have had multiple D.C. businesses. Multiple businesses were taverns and restaurants, including Room 11, Petworth Citizen, Slim's Diner, Upshur Street Books, and the 48-Hour Film Project, an international filmmaking competition. Paul Rupert was interviewed in 2014 about his great-grandfather's hardware store and the Rupert legacy in DC. Paul Rupert was best known for partnering with local food and drink experts for the popular bars The Passenger, the Columbia Room, and Hogo. Rupert got his start in restaurants after graduating from college. When he returned to DC, he convinced his mother to open a restaurant in 1992. So we took the building that we owned on 7th Street, where a Hogo restaurant was. At that time, Rupert Real Estate was downstairs, so we moved it upstairs and renovated the first floor. At that time, it was an area where many might not have felt safe venturing through at night. Working down there in the real estate office as a kid, that was our neighborhood. We took precautions, but it didn't seem like a rough neighborhood. That's where the family business was, and we knew everyone who worked in the area. We were both in the kitchen, and my sister was out front. And we had a little bit of success, and we had some customers, but we weren't profitable. We knew we had to hire a chef, so we could go and do more to draw people in. We hired a fantastic chef, John Cochran, who we eventually sold the business to, and he turned it into this fantastic restaurant. Lots of Washingtonians will recognize this building when we realize that it was across the street from the convention center downtown. The Greenville map from 1913 show multiple lots carved into many different shapes because the land was bought and sold to multiple owners over the years. The whole lot wasn't sold to just one person. One lot would have been chopped up 5 or 6 times and another 3 or 4 times after that. The United States Congress created the U.S. National Arboretum in 1927, and it covers 446 acres of land. The Arboretum started buying up most of the land in Greenville to create a large botanical garden of over 7,000 different plants, trees, shrubs, and flowers. Interesting enough, not only do Hickey Hill Road still exist inside of the Arboretum, but also Hickey Lane, Hickey Hill, and Hickey Run. As it is today, the National Arboretum is on the west side of the Anacostia River. The Mount Olivet Cemetery is across the street on the opposite side of Bladensburg Road. Anton Rupert's property was near the intersection where now there's a gas station and hotels. There's still a small residential section of houses and apartment buildings outside of the Arboretum. Let's take a closer look at the intersection of New York Avenue and Bladensburg Road. We will go to the opposite side of the street from where Anton's house was. Today, these fast food restaurants have been closed for several years. When they were open, they weren't truly thriving but surviving. The customer base wasn't big enough and the crime activity was overwhelming. But I think it was the world-changing event in 2020 that sealed the deal of closing these stores. If you go to the top of the hill and stand at the corner intersection, you'll notice that Montana Avenue actually crosses both New York Avenue and Bladensburg Road, creating a triangle. The city is looking at this triangle as a perfect opportunity for a mixed-use development. The zoning designation that has historically dominated most of the New York Avenue corridor has created an industrial-heavy area that has long posed as an environmental injustice for the residents. So the DC Office of Planning is arranging to have the New York Avenue corridor turn into a development of additional housing with the goal of adding 33,000 new housing units within the next 20 years. At least a third of those would be affordable. The focus will be on transforming the 3-mile stretch between Florida Avenue and South Dakota Avenue, which includes the neighborhoods Brentwood, Langdon, and Ivy City, into a gateway corridor for this area of the city. And for Upper Northeast, New York Avenue is one of the key gateways of getting into the nation's capital. DC has recently adopted a plan that will provide a unique opportunity to transition the corridor to a mix of housing, retail, civic, and open spaces for residents, workers, and visitors. The change along New York Avenue is being propelled by the redevelopment of Union Market and the Noma neighborhoods. The New York Avenue corridor has important commercial, municipal, and infrastructure uses that influence our daily lives in DC, such as facilities for government vehicles and utilities. These areas are where the metro buses are maintained, municipal waste and recycling are managed, local food and beverages are manufactured, and construction companies are based here. Arbor Place is a project that will consist of 69,000 square feet of retail space along New York Avenue, 1,400 multi-family residential units, a daycare center, a health club, retail, and residential parking. A network of 3 internal streets will be created in the 16-acre site, creating a pedestrian-friendly, interconnected neighborhood. But the blog DC Mud contradicts that, with a blog post stating an article from the Washington Business Journal, "Arbor Place is no more." The article says that the New York Avenue project was first destined to offer 3,500 condominiums, then retooled it as a subsidized housing project, and is now officially, clinically deceased. The developer had seriously downsized the project and was working with the DC government to subsidize the first phase of construction. The developer told the Washington Business Journal that the $1.1 billion mixed-use housing project under current fiscal conditions was next to impossible. The developers admitted that the scaled-down new application reflects changes to market conditions. The original plan called for approximately 3,500 residential units, 148,000 square feet of retail space, 4,200 parking spaces, and 1 acre of open space. The drastically smaller new plan offered 1,400 residential units, 1,200 parking spaces, 69,000 square feet of retail space, and 2 acres of open space. Downsizing to a less dense space couldn't save this doomed project. As for now, we will just wait for another developer to step up to the plate to revitalize this area. The beginning of Bladensburg Road on the DC side starts at the Starburst, the largest intersection in DC because it has 2 streets, 2 avenues, and 2 roads. Benning Road, Bladensburg Road, Florida Avenue, H Street, Maryland Avenue, and 15th Street. H Street wasn't connected to Bladensburg Road until 1849, and back then they called it Bladensburg Pike. Bladensburg Road has a lot of history and has had a lot of historical people and has had a lot of historical events, and there are more stories to explore. I'll take you with me to walk around the National Arboretum in another video one day. Have you been there? It's free admission, you know. What do you think should happen to the New York Avenue corridor? More stores? More schools? More housing? More playgrounds? Or just more open spaces? Let me know in the comments, what would you like to see in this area of Ivy City going down New York Avenue corridor? I would like to thank the sponsors of this video, Crunk74 and Malika Matthews. I thank you. And I also want to thank you for following me around DC for the scenery and the history. I'm Dickie D, your DC tour guide, and I will see you in the next video.